There was a doctor named Dr. Semmelweis in Hungary over 100 years ago, and he was concerned because the mortality rate of women having babies was high, and it was especially high in one of the hospitals he worked at and not in another. So he decided to try and figure out why it was this was happening, and he began to eliminate things that could be distinct about the hospitals until he came to the final distinction: one hospital that had midwives, one hospital that had doctors. And the hospital that had doctors also had cadavers that they were doing autopsies on. And he discovered that doctors were doing autopsies and then going and delivering women's babies. And then the women were getting sick. And so he said, well, there's probably a connection then between dead bodies and people getting sick, especially when we're delivering babies. And so he said, we should probably start washing our hands. And he became the doctor that introduced the practice of hand washing in the medical profession. Because up until that point, it wasn't something that they did. Now, we shouldn't say that he announced, we're going to start washing hands, and everyone goes, you know what a great idea. He was resoundingly rejected by the medical establishment. People were offended. They said, how dare you? We're not going to wash our hands. You're saying we're the problem. He actually ended up committed to an asylum. And when he was in the asylum, he was beaten by guards. He got a wound that became infected, and he died at age 46. Now, anyone in this church, if I were to say, who here does not believe they should wash their hands, you would go, well, that's ridiculous. In fact, we should be washing our hands and sanitizing our hands and then washing our hands again and then sanitizing our hands. If you go to Hoag Hospital, on every elevator door, it says 80% of infections are transmitted when people don't wash their hands. It is to us an obvious facet of reality that if you don't wash your hands, someone might get sick. You might carry something from one person to the next. But for hundreds of years, dare we even say thousands of years, this was not even part of the human equation and how it was that life worked. And so are there things that may be obvious to some who know that are not obvious to others? And for us, it's not hand washing. For us, it's not the transmission of infection or bacteria or viruses or whatever. For us, as Christians, it's resurrection. For us as Christians, the defining characteristic, an obvious facet or feature of reality that shapes our behavior, or should, is resurrection. And you'll notice that in the two stories we have today, one about Sadducees, resurrection, marriage, and how to interpret the Bible, one from the book of Job about human suffering and the meaning of human suffering, where it comes from and where it's going. In both of those instances, resurrection emerges. Jesus communicates it clearly in an argument, and in Job's case, it almost erupts out of his sadness for what he's facing. Now, oftentimes you'll hear people describe something called the Second Temple period, which, as you might imagine, is the period that the Second Temple stood. So it's pretty much captures the whole meaning. The first temple was built during Solomon, destroyed by the Babylonians almost 500 years later. The second temple was built after the exile and then was destroyed by the Romans almost 500 years later. And in that second temple, all of these parties start emerging. Like if you read your Old Testament and then stop and then start reading your New Testament, you'll have all sorts of characters who weren't there before. You won't find a Pharisee in the Old Testament. You won't find a Sadducee in the Old Testament. You won't find a Herodian in the Old Testament. During the Second Temple period, these parties emerge, and they become important conversation partners with Jesus. And so today, the conversation partners are the Sadducees. Now, for us, very few of us, I think, would fight over biblical interpretation, though maybe some of us would. But for the people in the time of Jesus, and even in certain places in Judaism today, and probably in certain places in Christianity, how you read the Bible informs everything. It's sort of like whenever someone becomes a Supreme Court justice, we want to know, how do you read the Constitution? Do you read it only for its original meaning and nothing more than the words written on the page? Do you read it for the original meaning plus the interpretations that have been created since the time of the original blah, blah, blah? And we have this question of interpretation. How wedded are you to the text? How wedded are you to changes in time and place? So when I was a student in high school, our civics teacher goes, "The Constitution of the United States is a living document, and it is living and changing and breathing like anything." And then I went up onto the Army post where I grew up, and Judge Antonin Scalia was speaking, and he said, "The Constitution is dead, and it is chained to a rock, and you shall not move it." And I go, well, which one is right? But those are the two schools of interpretation. And you had the same thing with the Torah, the first 5 books of the law. The Sadducees were an aristocratic minority in the time of Jesus who interpreted only the written text of the law, which meant that oral interpretation of the law did not become a feature of deciding what was in the book and not. It almost has a similar vein to Protestantism after the time of Luther. Like, for example, if you've ever been to a Church of Christ church and they don't play music, they go, well, where's music played in the New Testament? It's not in the text. It's not in the book. If it's not in the book, we're not going to do it. Where have they baptized a baby? It's not in the book. We're not going to do it. And so for these people coming to Jesus, they say, we don't read any stories about people being resurrected from the dead. It's not in the book. It's not in the text. And in our time, we might say, are you pro-life? Are you pro-choice? Are you anti-abortion? Pro-anti? We use those terms for political debates. And in this, it says the Sadducees were anti-resurrection. They're the anti-resurrection party, and we're the pro-resurrection party. And so they come to Jesus wondering if, in fact, they can trap him using the terms of the law and the terms of questions about marriage law. It's very much insider baseball. Most people here have never wondered about a chain of marriages. At the end when it says the woman died, well, after marrying 7 brothers, no wonder she died, right in a row. But this question about being married and this question about resurrection, they're trying to reduce the argument to absurdity, right? That's a rhetorical device. You reduce an argument to its absurd conclusion so that people they look at it and they go, yeah, that really is kind of stupid now that you put it that way. And Jesus doesn't berate them. Jesus doesn't criticize them. He just goes, you've misunderstood the fundamental nature of reality. You just happen to be wrong on something big. And this is something that we have to contend with as religious people, no matter how many Bible studies we've been to, no matter how many books of theology we've read, no matter how many services we've heard, podcasts we've listened to. On some major issues, we may simply be wrong about what God is doing. And what I mean by that is we have to live with an openness that the truth, because there is a truth, the truth transcends us. We do not contain it. We do not control it. We do not deploy it. When you have a closed system of truth deployment, you have an ideology. And Christianity is not an ideology. The truth transcends us, even as we participate in it. And so on some things we have to say, we just might have to listen, or we just might have to trust. We just might have to walk in faith. And as obvious as it is to us who are modern people that you've got to wash your hands, to Jesus, it was equally as obvious that resurrection is just part of the fabric of what God is made and is doing. He doesn't even argue. He just says, look, no, you just misunderstand what resurrection is. Here's what it is. And here's who we are. And our church is literally named Resurrection. So our particular witness should be a witness to the reality of resurrection. So we might say that sometimes religious conversation, even over centuries, can make people short-sighted, and what we're thinking about isn't necessarily the grand scope that God is calling us to. That can happen. But the second part of this, which is from the book of Job, is maybe much more personal and familiar, which is, how do I make sense of who God is in the face of innocent and meaningless suffering? Now, it's one thing if we do something and our suffering is a result of that. We do something we shouldn't do and we pay the price for it. That's just the way life works. It's another thing when all of a sudden you're hit with something that you had no responsibility for, you weren't expecting, you weren't anticipating, maybe you were even a little afraid of, and that's Job. Job is a long line of innocent sufferers that will finally lead us to the cross of Jesus, the place of ultimate innocent suffering to be redeemed. And Job has the problem of well-meaning friends. So if you've read the book, he has 3 friends who are in constant conversation with him about why his life is so terrible. And if you read the chapters, I would encourage you, if you need 15 minutes of reading, read the 3 chapters of Job before this chapter. I mean, Job says, I'm skin and bones. I have big black circles under my eyes. I can't sleep. My friends are horrible. Everything about my life sucks. Everything. Not one thing in my life is good. And then when his friends come, they comfort him by going, well, you probably did something. And that's their comfort to him. Well, what did you do that your life ended up this way? He goes, I didn't do anything. And they go, you're telling us that you're smarter than all the wisdom of the people who came before. Sometimes people's suffering is so overwhelming that we come up with reasons for it to have happened because it scares us that it might happen to us. So sometimes we will accuse suffering people of something just so we feel more comfortable with their suffering. And that's a real problem we have as human beings. When we were at a funeral of a young person last year, we said that to the kids who were at the funeral, going, don't let adults who are uncomfortable with your grief keep you from grieving. And we are uncomfortable with it because we don't like watching people suffer. We don't like watching people be sad. And we know that there's nothing we can say or do to improve their suffering, and so we just don't know what to do with it. And Job's friends don't know what to do with it. And so Job calls them, you miserable comforters. You're miserable in the way that you comfort me. And the book's like 50 chapters long, so that's how long the cycle of comfort keeps coming after Job's lost his wife and lost his children, lost his health, lost his reputation. And in the midst of Job crying out, we get this snippet that was read to us this morning where resurrection emerges. In the midst of his suffering, in the midst of the unsatisfying questions, in the midst of something that will ultimately not be resolved in the book. And I think that's very comforting to human beings. There will be things that happen to us that will not be resolved with comfortable questions this side of heaven. That's just reality. In the middle of that, resurrection emerges. And now what does he say? He says, oh, I wish I could write these words and engrave them on stone or with an iron pen. And he's not saying that. I mean, this is almost like a Shakespearean monologue, but like yelling it out, oh, that I could engrave these, and he's accusing God. I want to write something down so that when I'm standing before you again, you will have to answer me. Now, what Job finds out is by the end of the book, he doesn't have to wait for resurrection for God to answer him. But that's a wonderful idea. I wish I could write this down and let it stand forever until I'm resurrected and God has to answer me. Isn't I? God has to answer me. And what does Job say? He goes, I know that my Redeemer lives. So now we even have a hymn about that because it's such a great line. I know that my Redeemer lives, and I will stand at the end in my flesh, and I will see him with my eyes and not the eyes of another. This is a powerful testimony about resurrection of the body, that the Christian belief is not that we're just enduring souls who go to heaven and play harps and have wings and kind of the cartoon Tom and Jerry version of heaven. The Christian belief is, like Job says, we will rise in our bodies, glorified. So in case you don't like your body, it does get better. Glorified. And with our eyes, ourselves, we will see God and not another. And this will be the resolution to innocent suffering. It'll be the resolution to things that were undone or never tied up or loose ends. It will be the resolution where all of those things come together and find themselves embraced by the crucified hands of Jesus. And so this becomes where we stake our claim, both with the cross of Jesus and the resurrection of Jesus. The cross, very much like Job, Jesus suffers innocently, though he doesn't have a long enough time to have his friends try and blame him for it. Jesus suffers innocently, and that innocent death is redeemed by resurrection. And so God is on the side of all those who are crucified in the world. God is on the side of all those who bear a cross unjustly, and God will take all those who die, and they will stand before him in their flesh. And that's why we say in the Creed every week, we believe in the resurrection of the body, the literal embodiedness of human beings. And that's why caring about issues related to human bodies, including, like we saw earlier, the bodies of homeless veterans, should move the heart of the church. So this is our calling as we leave this place. In the same way that you would find it ridiculous that no one would wash their hands because it's so obvious that it transmits something bad, you need to be a bearer of the obviousness of resurrection. Your life needs to be the witness of the obvious reality of resurrection. And it doesn't mean you have to walk around with a big smile on your face. Job becomes a witness to the obviousness of resurrection in the midst of great suffering. Sometimes it's the cross and resurrection together. But that becomes our special calling as we help the world understand where it's going, the end point. And by lifting up our heads, we see the light that God calls us to, which is fullness of life. Amen.